I'm going to tell you a secret, but first, you have to promise that you won't laugh. This is still an uncomfortable subject for me, so I'd appreciate for your understanding. Do we have a deal? When I was 5 years old, I watched a movie no child should ever see. I don't remember much about the circumstances of my viewing other than it was the house where my family lived late at night in the dark with only the television providing light. The film was an animated feature and depicted themes of animal cruelty, death, and dismemberment. The scenes were surreal and terrifying and left a deep impression on me. For years afterwards, the only scene I could remember clearly was an evil man drowning a family of cats in a stream, which I would have nightmares about for years afterwards. I remembered seeing it early in the movies, followed by many other disturbing and surreal scenes. Remember your promise, because it's the part I'm talking about. I never told anyone about what I saw, but the name of the movie was well known. The Aristocats. I can forgive you about when I broke your promise, but I must empathize that I am not joking. What I saw was the movie called The Aristocats, filled with the scenes I have described, and it scared me for life. I didn't think about the experience very often, but it was back in my mind for some way. Though I didn't realize it at the time, now I know because it was shy away from my animation children's show. It subtly informed my whole outlook on the trappings of childhoods. I found myself bracing with dread whenever I watched any children's animation in school. My childhood was relatively normal otherwise, but for an introvert anyway. But every once in a while, I would think back to the movie and would find my inner peace disturbed. It wasn't until maybe third or fourth grade that I started to realize that my experience with the movie has been not typical. I didn't tell anyone, not even my parents, about what I witnessed in that dark room at age 5, but eventually I figured out on my own that there was nothing horrific about the version everyone else had watched. I still wasn't willing to see it for myself, but I figured it was what I seen. I would have been able to tell you whatever they spoke off of the film. Anyone who had anything to say about it seemed considered either a nostalgic classic or unremarkable. When I was in middle school, I asked my mom if I ever seen the Aristocats. She said that I had once, having stayed up on my past bad time and watched it secretly. She said I seemingly had been strangely disturbed by the film and had never wanted to watch it again as a small child. I asked if we could still have it in the house, but she said I would have been afraid of the movies, that she had thrown it out. It had been a VHS recording she bought at an estate sale, rather than a retail copy. I finally decided to watch the movie again. I ordered it from the library and watched it one Saturday. Took me a couple hours to work up the courage to finally hit play. I found it to be a wonderful film. Immediately, I realized that whatever I was seeing at age 5 had nothing to do with this movie. There was no graphic violence, no psychedelic scenes, nothing to do that should have traumatized me as a child. And yet, what I had seen all those years ago definitely shared elements with this movie. The kittens and their mother were drugged and kidnapped, but not drowned. I instantly recognized the moments that leading up to this divergence and almost had a flashback to the cartoon drowning I witnessed. I was hoping had to find closure, but instead I am more troubled than ever. There was no question in my mind now. I had viewed some awful and perverted versions of the classic film. I told one of my friends about it a few days later. I didn't let him know how convinced I was as what I had seen as a young child. Instead, simply relating it as a vague and confused memory. Like, hey, the other day I saw the Aristocats. I used to be terrified in the movie because for some reason I thought I saw gore scenes and cats drowning when I watched it at 5 years old. Funny how hasn't your memories played tricks on you that age, isn't it? He told me about the movie Felladay. He explained that it was an animated movie about cats with a similar animation style that continued graphic gore scenes that was definitely not for children. He said maybe I somewhat saw that movie instead of the Aristocats. I streamed and watched Feladay. What I saw my friend meant about having the same feel as the Aristocats, except dark and bloody. But it wasn't what I had seen. I knew for sure that 5-year-old me had watched the movie for the same characters as the Aristocats, and I knew it was for sure they had contained bizarre and disturbing scenes not shown in the mainstream version. The whole thing was driving me up to a wall. To try to get some kind of closure, I started seeking out and watched old children's animations that contained graphic and disturbing elements that should never be included today, such as Watership Down, the 1978 version. While these works were interesting and gripping in their own way, they were decidedly not Disney. While other studios have been willing to take such risks for their works decades ago, the fact that the Aristocats is a Disney property made me sure that the version I had first seen was something I absolutely was not supposed to ever. I let it go for a while. After a while, a few years passed, and in college I learned about this internet urban legend called lost episodes. People claim to have seen episodes of TV shows or altered versions of movies, usually animated, that contain graphic and disturbing scenes. The episode or movie was often found in an unexpected place, and those who claiming to have seen it has said it mysteriously disappeared, whether through a VHS tape appearing to have somehow self-erased, a website going dead immediately after viewing it, etc. To be honest, I didn't put much stock in the validity of these stories, but when my Aristocats experience still in the back of my mind, I decided to look further into it. I found a YouTube channel called Cartoon Geek, who was discussing a certain lost episode for his 40,000 subscriber special. After going through obligatory thanks and talking to him about how much his subscribers meant to him and all that, he began, "Now for all of you who are new to this channel, I'm basically just a guy obsessed with all these things nostalgic and geeky about cartoons and other media. Most of my content is simply reviewing old cartoons and whatnot, especially superhero related. However, I do a side series on strange and creepy side of animations. For example, my 20k sub was a 3-part series on Disney and their alleged subliminal messages in films and television. And this video you're watching now is sort of that in the same vein. We are going to be taking another look at a certain lost episode. For those who don't know, lost episodes are basically this urban legend about episodes of TV show which were lost. As the name implies, these episodes are said to contain graphic and disturbing and surreal elements that are regarded as material that the public was not meant to see. A few months ago, I covered an alleged lost episode from the 1968 filmation series The Adventures of Batman. I loved this show as a kid, even though it was decades before my time, and there was one episode with a scene of Batman and Robin fall through a trapdoor set by the Joker and slide it toward their doom. At the end of the slide tunnel is a giant open furnace, looking like the Joker's face. Of course, since kids showed they don't actually slide into the furnace and burn alive. They get out with their gadgets. So to recap, in the 2009, this anonymous internet user post started circulating online about an alleged lost version of the scene. In it, a dynamic duo actually do slide into the furnace, burn alive, scream, and showing graphically being burnt to a crisp, followed by a surreal and non-linear scenes of grieving friends of Bruce Wayne and mourning in the funeral service. Now, when I did my first video on this onto this subject, I was honest with you guys. I didn't really think there was much credibility to the story. I like to keep an open mind to on the show, but there was just certain elements of the post that just made me say, okay, this is probably bullshit. Like, how did the tape conventionally erase itself after the anonymous author viewed it? But since I've gotten a lot of comments and emails talking about how allegedly this lost episode has been posted online, naturally a lot of you are already saying this is fake, but this topic won the poll for this special, so let's find out. After some more preamble, the video cut to the alleged lost episode. At that part where Batman and Robin are sliding down the tunnel toward the furnace, all the parts where the two use their belt gadgets to get free and were removed. And when the two were close to the furnace, the screen is filled with fire, with poor quality shrieks played. After that, there were some strange abstract scenes, but all of these seemed to be simply random clips from other episodes with some editing effects thrown into them. Cartoon Geek returned. Okay, so be right off the bat, Batman and Robin die off screen, which is obviously not what happened in the lost episode that was shared around. They basically just used used the flame from earlier in the scene and cut them over to make them look like Batman and Robin died. Adding in a canned screamed effect, the surreal scenes that followed were also just random clips throughout the show with various editing tricks applied. I could have done of them myself. So while this is impressive work, I think it's pretty clear that it's a fan project inspired by the anonymous post. I'm going to rate this animation myth as debunked for now. He gave some more breakdown and construction of the clip before ending it with some kind of promotional giveaway. What really got my attention, however, was some of the comments. There were at least a few people that insisting that the lost episode was real and they had seen it with their own eyes. I PM'd one of these people and asked if he really seen the episode about the circumstances. He responded within an hour. Yeah, I was at a summer school and during recess I snuck into the school's library's back room to be alone. I put a VHS of the cartoon that there was there and saw it. Honestly, I really wasn't disturbed back then since my parents let me watch R-rated horror movies and stuff back then, well. But yeah, this thing is real. I asked if he knew any information about the supposed lost episode phenomena, but he did not. I did some research on my own. There were a few lost episode stories floating around the internet, mostly about children's shows. To be honest, not many of them seemed all that credible, since I strongly felt that there was something real behind all these establishments and fictional legends. I decided to see if there's any such stories surrounding the Aristocats. My searches for disturbing content in the movie returned nothing but the expanded, this one scene in the Aristocats totally scared me alive as a kid. Stuff for more information about that Feliday movie. I tried reaching out to some of the credited animators, writers, and crew members, varying the content of my emails, so as to cast as a wide as net as possible. For example, some of my emails focused on disturbing content that might have been cut, while other drafts asked more generally about the alternative versions or cutscenes. I also expanded my web searches with all these search engine tricks so I could find. Started using obscured foreign language engines. After a few months of no information and no responses to my email queries, I started to think that maybe I should just forget about the whole thing. Maybe my real memories of watching the Aristocats had merged with some nightmare I had to create my present memories, and maybe even repeating those memories to myself many times during my childhood and falsely convinced of me of their reality. I was about to consign to this newfounded self-closure when I found something during one of my foreign language searches. It was a thread of the Chinese message board. The OP had a JPEG in the image, and the text roughly translated to, Aristocats movie creepy? If I had copied or dropped and spilled over my computer, I would have. The image dashed away any hope of I had off my passing my child experience as just a traumatic nightmare that had stuck in my head longer than it should have. It was a frame of whatever twisted version of the Aristocats I had seen, and while I hadn't actually remembered this particular stuff until I found this message board, the instant I saw it, I remembered the clip, and more memories started flooding back. Still vague, but vivid and definitely real. I was now firmly convinced that I had before that violent version of the movie was real. The image of was the black kitten Berlioz with his face nearly filled the frame, and his eyes were wide and terrified, red veins bulging, his fur was standing up as if they were charged with electricity. The picture itself wasn't any more inherently disturbing than the grotesque fan art you can find for all kinds of different shows and movies, but unlike those other images, I knew this one had genuinely sinister story of some kind behind it. As such, it haunted me like no other image had ever had. There were only a few couple of replies on the threads, of both, both of which were short, and neither of which provided any more information about the image. I used Google Translate to tried to ask the LP for more information, but never received a response. I performed a reverse image search of the file, but it returned no other results. However, a few weeks later, I finally got my reply to one of the emails I had sent to the production staff. The reply was one of the emails I had written on that hinted more strongly that the reality that I was seeing as a kid, but the response was short and curt. But it gave me new hope for finding the answers. Hello, sorry for the later response, but I read between the lines of your message. If you've seen what I was thinking you were hinting at, you need to look into the Lost Media Group. That's all I'm going to say on subject. I googled Lost Media Group, but the closest thing I could find was a website on the online club called the Lost Media Society. It was a site for media enthusiasts to collect, trade, sell, buy, and discuss lost media, including lost episodes, as in real lost episodes that simply never aired. Not the urban legend, the ones that contain surreal, disturbing, or even supernatural content. This community was interesting in its own right and became involved in it, eventually even becoming a site moderator. Once I was established as a respected regular, I decided to PM one of the head admins and ask him about the Lost Media episode Legends. He responded that he had heard of it, but it wasn't really something the site dealt with. He recalled that in the past and been talked about it, and even suggest banning discussions about it since it seemed as a spam topic for a while. I asked if he knew about an organization called the Lost Media Group. He said he had heard of it, but he didn't know anything about it, and suggested that he could contact a certain other admin who did not know about this entity. I messaged this admin in response within the hour. Told me the Lost Media Group was the group alleged by some is behind the lost episodes phenomenon. According to him, they produce not just altered versions of movies and television episodes, but were also making their own versions of the other media, such as video games and comic books. He said he did not know much else about them, and other than some lost media collectors were willing to pay large sums of authentic work by this group, and that before the Lost Media Society has banned discussions of lost episode legends of these collectors and had asked them about on the site. I asked if he could refer me as such a collector. He said my best would be the certain retired site admin who was no longer in the Lost Media Society. He linked me a couple of archived threads by an individual about lost episodes and gave me the man's email address. I shot him an email asking about his interest in lost episodes, and went as far to directly know if he knew about a lost episode type version of the Aristocats. A few months went by with no response. During this time, I researched as much as I could about lost episodes. I found out about another alleged lost episode of the Flintstones. The story behind this episode was much like other lost episode stories. Special episode of the show that aired on an otherwise unused television channel and had gory and surreal content. The main difference between the story and the others was this one had a somewhat credible outside source. The original forum had a link to a digitally archived local news article from the 1979. The FCC had received complaints from dozens of people claiming to see the episode. The complaints came from the Lake Kabagama region of Minnesota. with most originating from a couple of lake specific lake resorts. The incident was locally known as the Kabagama incident broadcast. I decided on the next logical step was to contact the FCC for more details. They responded within a week, saying that unfortunately they were not at liberty to give out such information. At that moment, I considered filing a Freedom of Information request, but decided to take a different route. One of the two lake resorts most heavily involved within the incident was still in operation. I scheduled a vacation from work, and a few weeks later, I was on my way to Lake Kabagama. Kleck's Cove was a collection of 15 cabins, a bar restaurant, and a small boat dock with boats available for lease. I had rented an old A-frame unit and planned to stay for 2 weeks. The resort was a nice place to stay. I spent a few days fishing and seeing local attractions. I fell in a group of regulars who fish at the resort every year. We went on several boat trips before I had enough courage to ask the oldest of them about the Kabagama broadcast. Oh, that. Funny thing, I actually just missed out on the old thing. It happened a week ago before I stayed here in the summer of '79. I heard about it through. You'll have to talk to Ed about it. He was there. He was referring to Ed Kleck, the founder and properties of Kleck's Cove. I considered asking about the Kabagama broadcast before, but he wanted to feel out the locals first. However, at this point, I decided that I was being overly cautious and chose to follow the man's advice. Mr. Kleck was in his late 70s, but his memory was still sharp. He liked to tell stories and took advantage of this by starting a conversation about the history of the resort and the lake. This got him for going for a couple of hours before I brought up the Kabagama broadcast. Now, why do you want to know about that? He asked, seeming to taken aback. I told him I had read about it on the internet and what the story said. He shrugged and said, "Oh well, that pretty much happened. Nothing and much else to tell, really." I asked if he had seen the episode, to which he responded that he caught the end of the broadcast after being told about it as it was happening. He said what he saw was Barney dying a horrible bloody death and some Fox Stone Age contraption, but he didn't remember much else. He was reluctant to continue the conversation about much further, but he's sure that the incident was very real indeed. I pondered all I had learned on my drive home. I had been left with more questions than answers and didn't seem to get any closer tracking down the Aristocats' lost recording. The more I learned, the more questions came up. Well, was the disturbing Aristocats version I'd seen connected to the Kabagama broadcast, or was it alleged Batman and Robin lost episode? Or was I making connections where there were none? Did that person on YouTube who claimed to seen the Batman lost episode really see it? Or has he just been trolling me? Surely all these claims would have been coincidental, but there was no explanation for the existence of these lost episodes. While I was churning all this information over my mind, I didn't notice the vehicle behind me until I was right up on my bumper. I swerved as it made contact and careened into a ditch. The other car drove on, but without stopping. I wasn't injured. In fact, my airbag hasn't been deployed, but I sat in shock for many minutes afterwards. I finally got my bearings. I called 911 and told my location nearby the nearest mile market. It took about 45 minutes for a state officer to find me, but I told the police what happened. But I wasn't able to provide details such as the make or the color of the car that hit me or the license plate. I did not tell them what business I was on or lingering the suspicions that the incident had to do with my investigation of the Kabagama broadcast. Despite this experience, I decided to stick my neck out a little more. This was getting serious, and I needed a clear picture of who I was up against. I had an acquaintance in the FBI who owned my family for the favor of a lifetime. I convinced him over the dinner that I paid to look into the Lost Media Group for me. Within a few weeks later, he added documents for me. It was an analyst report containing all the information the FBI had on this mysterious group. The information known by the Beirut about the Lost Media Group is so scant as to strongly suggest the group does not really exist. This report assumes that the existence of the group has been for investigative purposes. However, most of the information contained herein is more speculation than confirmed fact. Most of the testimony considering the LNG has been hearsay and off the record. The exact nature, size, organization, origins, and goals of the LMG are mysterious. It is said to be a mutilational organization that has been embedded in multiple entertainment industries and is most active in cities with large concentrations of entertainment companies such as Los Angeles, New York City, Atlanta, Toronto, and Tokyo. The membership is by invitation and is rumored to include a number of wealthy entertainment executives and financiers. Secondhand information reports that the group uses a variety of criminal tactics, including bribery, blackmail, and violence to prevent the disseminations of the information concerning them. It is speculated that the LMG uses other crime syndicates such as proxies as their operations in order to obfuscate investigations into their activities. And they misled people into believing are more powerful than any they really are. Claims that the group possesses supernatural powers like any other result of selective disinformation campaigns. The Lost Media Group came to the Brewers' attention during the 1970s, but date back to the early 1900s. During the 1920s and the 1930s, an urban legend emerged concerning mystery reels, which were said to be altered versions of syndicate movie theaters reels that were differed cynically in content and tone from the standard copies. The Beirut believes that the lack of public awareness of entertainment industry standards and copyright contributed to the fact such works were not reported to the media or law enforcement. The recurring theme in testimony concerning mystery reels is that they often contain violent content that was more extreme than mainstream theater content, and several former members of censorship boards claim to receive that complaints about them. Witnesses also complained that the mystery reels were based on live action films during different actors, and that these actors in retrospect has been seen to be cussered. One witness claimed that an actor in a silent mystery reel appeared to be saying "help me" before getting silenced by someone off screen. These claims have led the Beirut to believe that the LMG may be participating in trafficking in human beings. The group is also rumored to have involved in production and distribution of snuff films, though there is as little evidence to support this claim as there is support to the existence of snuff film movies. Other crimes the Lost Media Group is suspected to be include media piracy, drugging of actors, trafficking, endangerment species for use in film, and recording executions for other criminal organizations. I pondered over the report. Membership by invitation is only well-funded, well-connected, must be well organized. Yet their activities seem nothing but short of bizarre. Why would a group with these kinds of resources this group apparently had? Unlike the FBI, I was beginning to take the existence of the Lost Media Group for granted at this point. Did not spend on them on more traditional and profitable criminal activities. Why would that many people commit so many resources and risk so much just to make movies? There is no way that such a sophisticated syndicate would enough make enough money for off of simple piracy to be considered profitable, and the other crimes listed in the report would seem beyond the scope of expertise of cable ostensibly comprised of people in the entertainment industries. Was it not about money? The ideological or religious motivation, perhaps. It certainly didn't fit any religion I could think of, and didn't seem that they were interested in influencing elections. Their motives must be subtler. They had a message they wanted to send, but or an influence they wanted to create using the power of mass media and willing to dabble in any number of crimes towards whatever their ultimate end was. A few weeks later, I received a reply from the former Media Society admin, the one who was said to be attempting to collect lost episodes. He told me that he was not aware of an Aristocats lost episode version, but that he was nevertheless now in possession of several lost episode copies, and was willing to show them to me, for a price, to be exact. He wanted $1,000. I agreed without hesitation. I was not at a point in my life where I could comfortably spend $1,000 on anything, let alone a proper respect that might not deliver. But I was not trying to talk to him do a lower offer because it would make him break contact, and something in my gut told me that his claims were sincere. He gave me the address of a secluded cabin he would rent for the purpose, which was several states away. He said he would come alone, and gave me the exact date he expected me there. I was a little put off by his curt tone, but he figured he was paranoid of someone stealing his collection or worse, being hunted down by the people who made the items. I prepared for the trip and left immediately. When I arrived in the state where the cabin was, it was still a couple days until our mating date, so I checked into a hotel. I was up late watching TV in my hotel room with the lights out. When I found a channel playing the Aristocats, it was in the middle of the movie, but I kept watching. I grew nervous. I already had watched the whole movie and knew that there was nothing unwholesome in the standard version. But the setting, alone in the dark with just the light of the TV, strongly reminiscent of my traumatic virgin experience with the feature. Soon enough, my unease turned to comfort. I realized that there was nothing to fear. Sure, at this point, I was convinced that there was something out there existed, a violent and twisted version of the Aristocats, which one I've been unfortunate enough to see somehow as a child. But that didn't matter. It couldn't hurt me now. I laughed as I realized I now had the chance to relieve the memory without the trauma. So I grabbed a snack and continued watching in the dark, for once able to enjoy the film as it was intended to be enjoyed. I was able to appreciate what a truly great movie it was, how much effort it was put into the animation and the voices, how great everything was, even the music was. The soundtrack was a little distorted though. As I turned up the volume to hear it better, I realized it wasn't the TV. The music became faster and more distorted, and the scene began morphing into abstract images. I heard screams from the TV and disturbing images to make out clearly flashed on the screen. This all ended with a still image of Berlioz, the one I found on the internet with his eyes with bloodshot. On the images were the two words in red caps: "Stop asking." The screen then went to black. I sat in total darkness, with my body quaking, tears and snot running down my face, hardly able to catch my breath. I turned on the lights to throw up in the bathroom and switched the channel with all the stations were playing normal television, which was something comforting. But I still checked out of the hotel and went to a different one. At this point, I considered giving up the hunt. My first goal was been able to find out if the lost episodes were real, and I had certainly achieved at least that. Whether for going further and finding out the exact nature and origin of them was worth it. It was becoming an increasingly dubious prospect. Whoever's behind them had powers and resources to seriously threaten me. I didn't know his full closure was worth risking my neck any further. In the end, I decided to keep going through. I was close now, and if there was some secret powerful group behind all these lost episode stories, the world needs to know. Who were they? Who were trying to intimidate me get into giving up? No, I wanted to give up the hunt. At that moment, I doubled down my determination. At that appointment time, I showed up at the cabin. It was night, and at the moon flooded the lonely cabin in an eerie glow. There was a vehicle in the driveway, but the lights were out, and there was no signs of occupying occupancy. It was timidly went up and knocked on the door without turning on any lights. The man greeted me. For his own safety, I will not describe the man, save to say he appeared middle-aged. So, you were serious about this time. Good. Do you have any money? Gave me the wallet of cash. He turned a lamp on and counted it out, then motioned me to follow him into another room. He closed the door behind him before turning on the light. The room had a high ceiling and the miniature paintings on the wall, along with a single shelf of old books that were clearly there for decoration. Centered on one of the walls was a large plasma television. There was a lot of space, but the man himself only had put a couple of chairs and put some plastic storage tubs on the floor. So here's my collection. It ain't very big, but you'll have a hard time finding these items anywhere else. Sorry to charge you so much, but you gotta realize I'm taking such a huge risk by showing this stuff to a stranger, so you gotta make it worth my while. I trembled with anticipation. At last, I was about to have some real concrete answers. Like I said in my email, I don't have nor have previously heard of an Aristocats video made by these people, but from how you described it, I completely believe what you saw it. It fits right in the kind of thing you would make, he continued. By they, you mean the Lost Media Group, I interjected. Yeah, they would be behind the thing you saw, along with that Batman Lost episode if it indeed exists. Though I haven't been able to find it myself, but again, I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know what their goal is in making these things, but they're interesting as hell, so I can collect them. I asked if he could share some of his contacts, but he flatly refused. I only give that information to trusted friends, and even if you were one of them, I could make you pay more than you could afford. So please don't ask me that again. You're lucky that I could agree to show you my collection. I was a little flustered by his tone, so I just nodded. Then we got down to business. He opened one of the tubs and pulled out a VCR, along with a black VHS tape with a white label that read Pink Panther in black Sharpie. He hooked up the VCR, inserted the tape, and played it. It was a lost episode from the Pink Panther cartoon series, which consisting of short sketches, about 5 or 6 minutes each, with the Pink Panther going on various solo adventures and getting into trouble with other characters and situations, which he manages to do with his superior mastery of cartoon physics. There is never any dialogue, save for the occasional wordless explanation or babble nonsense like in the Tom and Jerry cartoons, and every short he has the Pink Panther theme playing throughout. I watched a little of the show as a kid, but didn't have memories of it. The episode was called 40 Shades of Pink, which I assume was a pun on how Ireland is said to have 40 shades of green, which this was a St. Patrick's Day themed episode. It took place in a green land that, while not explicitly identified as Ireland, was obviously supposed to be the Emerald Isle, or at least some generic insular Celtic fantasy land. The short involved the Pink Panther trying to steal a pot of gold from a leprechaun, or rather, the recurring little man character. dressed as one. As the Pink Panther was walking over the rainbow like a bridge, a storm cloud caused it to disappear from under his feet. He fell, and there was a sickening crunching sound. The Pink Panther was shown bleeding on the ground, bones jutting out. Then he saw the leprechaun's pot and crawled over to it. Despite his injuries, a smile of victory crawled across his face. As he appeared down into the pot, the leprechaun appeared from behind and pushed him in, closing a lid over him and then roasting him alive over a fire. The episode ended with the sound of Pink Panther screaming. Lame, I thought. Someone basically just took this Pink Panther cartoon and gave it the itchy and scratchy treatment. It was somewhat disturbing that whoever did it clearly had access to the original animations resources to make it look exactly like a real episode. But overall, it was underwhelming compared to what I was expecting. The next item was a copy of The Lion King. This time, it was a proper factory copy with a retail jacket. The man told me the movie itself was normal, but there was a special animated short at the end of the tape with psychedelic properties. He warned me that the experience would be far more intense than the Pink Panther tape, and he even asked me if I had any heart conditions. Despite his warnings, I insisted going through with it. He refused to fast forward to the short, saying he wanted to keep the tapes from warping even though he had the footage digitally archived. After the credits, there were some special features, including some animated shorts I had never seen before. When the title appeared for a short, it was called The Lion. The man paused and asked once again if I had assured to what I wanted to proceed. I nodded, and he played it. The short was apparently a version of Scar, but the art style was completely different. It was a 2D animation, but somewhat more realistic than Pixar animation. It was hard to explain, it wasn't like CGI realism, but there was so much detail and effort put into the character that it gave the impression of realism, while still being paradoxically fantastical. The clip showed Scar walking around around a white background before stopping to face the viewer. The camera began slowly zooming in on his face, and his eyes began glowing red. Threatening jungle music began playing. Suddenly, I became very nervous. A vicious grimace appeared on Scar's face, the kind a predator makes before striking. His mouth opened wide, showing rows of sharp teeth, and I heard a realistic growling sounds. His face wrinkled in the pattern consisted with the face of a lion makes before pouncing. My nervousness turned to terror. My gaze was transfixed on the screen, and I couldn't look away. I knew it was only animated, even if it wasn't. The lion couldn't get to me through the screen, but I was paralyzed, as if I was facing a real predator. I was in a trance. That one didn't break until Scar jumped, and I screamed for my life. I kept screaming until the man shook me out of it. Sorry about that, he said, but I did warn you. Once I got my bearings back, I asked for the next item. He gave me a puzzled look, as if he had expected me to give up and wanted to go home after the last tape. But he shrugged and got the next one. It was another home VHS tape labeled Super Bowl 2000. This next one won't do anything to you like the Lion video, but it is disturbing in what it shows. In fact, I'll tell you what it is. This tape shows a riot that didn't happen. If you don't know, there was no sports riot at the 2000 Super Bowl. Certainly not in the stadium itself, but the tape shows that. Once again, the man refused to skip the interesting part to preserve the integrity of the tape. In the third quarter, a referee made a call that didn't sit well with the Titans fan, and someone threw a beer bottle. More people started throwing things and escalated into a full riot, in which the spectators swarmed the field and attacked each other. You could see what the majority of the crowd slowly evacuating the venue while a small but determined segment began vandalizing the place and having sporadic brawls. There was no commentary at this point, just raw stadium footage that cycled through various venue cameras. About 20 minutes into the riot, the tape ended. This tape did not cause me to experience abject terror like the last one. In fact, the riot didn't even had been there that bad compared to other sports riot I've seen. But I found it disturbing on a deeper level. The fact that they could alter a recording of a sports riot, a sports event, to make it show that it's something that so blatantly didn't even happen in reality terrified me. They could only have done it in two ways, with editing techniques that were really well beyond what was publicly known to the world, or some type of magic. I still ask to see what the next item. The man said it was the last one. It was a plug-in and play-in video game this time. The man explained that the Lost Media Group was known to dabble in other mediums besides movies and television, and then, in particular, they said to produce a lot of lost video games. Though this was the only one he was able to acquire. The game was labeled Pokemon Black Carbonite, which I remembered hearing Nintendo making a Pokemon plug-in game that was canceled, but I didn't know if that was the title. The thing was black and bore a white image of Pikachu, sporting a menacing grin. I'm not going to let you play this. I myself will never play it again. This thing will mess you up and is downright dangerous. You can examine the hardware, though. I took it from him and did so. The first thing I noticed upon closer inspection was a fissure in the control pad. A lot of force had been applied to make the crack. Then I noticed that some of the plastic was warped, melted. I looked at the man and he gave me a look back. A look of understanding that there was nothing more than needed to be said. I handed the game back to him. The man then said some goodbye formalities, put his hand over my shoulder and aggressively led me to the door, closing and locking it behind me. I never saw my camera. During the lion short, I managed to snap a quick digital photo of the TV screen while the man wasn't looking, and I had to put the camera back away before the whole bad acid trip thing. I had the photo enlarged and enhanced and studied it. It was still frightening, even without the physidelic properties of the animated short. Again, despite being a cartoon, it had such detail and realism that it seemed more alive than a cartoon could. I did some research on art and animation styles and learned that this technique was known as hyperrealism, a style intended to give intense lifelike detail using traditional non-digital art methods. Some pieces of this genre were almost indistinguishable from photographs. The lion wasn't quite that realistic. You could still tell easily enough that it was a cartoon, yet it's somewhat visually striking as a real photo of a lion. I continued my research, now focusing on finding people who were knowledgeable about this art form. I narrowed my search down to a few academics and animators and emailed them the lion still. I got a response from one expert saying the style reminded him of Juan Strobel, an Austrian artist and animator who moved to the United States in the 1930s. He had worked for Disney briefly before starting his own animation studios. He was known for his bizarre deconstructionist approach to animation and had started his own anti-art movement of some sorts. Animators and cartoonists have trained as studios to produce their own bizarre works, which included violent and grotesque themes, despite the fact that the studio ostensibly marketed to children. The email went on to explain that Strobel became increasingly obsessed with magic and the occult during his career. He became less and less functional until his studio was forced to close due to bankruptcy. Curiously, the studio was known to produce only a handful of original works on its own. Apparently, the animators spent a lot of time deconstructing and replicating the works of other companies, mainly Disney, since they were the only major animation studio at the time. And altering them to make them surreal or disturbing would have opened the company up to piracy claims. Except they never told such works to the public, instead of gifting them to a handful of collectors with the anti-art elite community. Strobel had also self-published a book, a manual of sorts, which contained prints of some of his still cartoons and constructions on his technique. It was simply titled "The American Deconstructed." I immediately determined to read it, but it took me ages to find a copy. I managed to track down one down at a public library headquarters 3 states away. The book was in their special archive collection, so I couldn't get it through an interlibrary loan. I had to drive there, where they would allow me to examine their archive reading room. The room was a sparse, dusty, and poorly lit. It had the feel of a 1950s police interrogation room that I was allowed to read the book of interest at the single table under the supervision of a librarian. It was yellowed, and the jacket was warped, wrapped in protective plastic. The volume was short enough to read in an hour. Strobel was not good at English, so he was at drawing. So the self-published aspect is really showed in numerous grammar errors. There was a couple dozen prints in the book, all made to his unique hyper-realistic style. Again, there weren't photorealistic like other artists in the genre, but had a depth of detail and perspective that made them alive all the same. None of them did anything paranormal or anything like that, but there was one that managed to seriously frighten me. It was a cartoon snake, a cobra with its fangs bared and a menacing look in its eyes. You know, some paintings have people with the eyes painted in such a way as to give the impression of a subject's gaze is following you as it views from a different angle. Well, this piece didn't do that, but it had some similar thing going on where its eyes of the snake appeared to bore right at through the page. Felt like the snake was going to strike up and dig its fangs into my arm. It didn't have a trippy experience with the lion animation, but was still surreal and unnerving. In addition to sections on art technique, Strobel had also included a number of seemingly random placed critiques of the state of animation that could generously be described as educated rants. A frequent target of his criticism was Walt Disney, who he decried as an amateur buffoon who was holding back the animation medium from its true potential. The author went on to empathize the need to be bold and daring in animation and willing to push social taboos. I returned the volume to the librarian. I hadn't discovered anything that would help me with my search through the Aristocats tape, but at least I had come away with some interesting insights to the philosophy of the man who has been behind it all. My next step was to visit Strobel Studios, which involved yet another cross-country trip. I started to wonder how much gas money I would end up spending by the end of my search from that damned video. It was really cheaper than flying. At least the studio was still standing, though I had arrived and anticipating of anything of major interest that would have been looted decades ago. Still, I held up as I pulled into a shopping center parking lot. The rest of my journey would have to be on foot since the studio had been predated modern roads. I crossed the interstate where they only had light traffic and followed the old dirt road that would have been the sole source of the vehicle traffic back then. By now, it was largely overgrown, and I cursed myself not to bringing a machete. It took me. It took me 2 hours to reach the location. It was a one-story wooden building with its windows boarded up and foliage growing all around it. I locked the perimeter looking for a way that wouldn't open me up to the charges of breaking and entering, though I was seriously doubted anyone would ever know or care I had been there in any case. To my disappointment, there was no entryway. Had been left by the previous urban explorers, and I had to hack away the boards of one window with a hatchet I had brought. It may be easier to smash down the door, but that felt somewhat less ethical. There was, of course, no source of light except the now open windowway, but I had the foresight to bring the high-power LED lamps in my backpack, which I now set up around the floor, relieved that I didn't see any scurrying or slithering. This place seemed very smaller on the inside, barely more spacious than in my basement at home. There was no furniture except a couple broken easels on the floor. Probably sold off the tables and desks to pay off their debts. I thought some scuff marks were visible on the wooden floor. There was a low wooden partition that sectioned off a small segment of the room. I guess that this is where the administrative desk had been, while the rest of the floor was used for the actual animation work. Like I said, I hadn't been really expecting to find anything important, but it was still disappointing. I spent the next couple of hours pacing the floor, wondering if the whole trip had been a waste of my time and mileage. I was about to pack up my lamps, and when I discovered a trap door behind the floor partition, I had taken one of the lamps off the floor to perch atop on the partition and light now to allow to see me the outline of the trapdoor, along with its hinges and latch. The door were there about 3 feet away, 3 feet by 2 feet. I grew excited and opened it. Annoyingly, the door did not appear to have a mechanism for staying open. It was too heavy for me to hold up, so I had to go back through the window and back several times just to bring some rocks, prop it up. But the contents of the compartment were worth it. The compartment was about 3 feet deep, and they contained what looked like diagrams for the animation or film device along with various little parts, knobs, bolts, lenses, and all the like, all scattered at the bottom. I studied with fascination, but I couldn't make out heads or trails of the schematics. I tried fitting parts of the together, but no success. I decided to taking these items with me. I'd rationalized that violating the law by entering this place was unlawfully was worth pulling back the curtain on whatever would cause my childhood trauma. But these items were unlikely to be one of the value that can end, and thus stealing them for my own curiosity would go beyond the bounds of justification. However, I did photograph each one of them and just in case. The next few months were uneventful. Once again, I felt like I hit a dead end. I took a break from the mission and focused on life obligations. I had just managed to comfortably put the lost episodes search on the back burner and feel content when I received an email for the subject, "What you've been looking for." I hesitated for a good few minutes before opening the message. "Hello, if you want answers, meet me at this address and time." My heart raced. This email wasn't from any address I had messaged. I instantly felt like I was going to get closure, and was suddenly terrified, perhaps even more terrified than I was at any point before in this journey. More than when I was run off the road, more than when I was hypnotized by a cartoon lion, more than when I was been threatened through a TV in the motel room. My hands were shaking so much I could hardly use the keyboard to navigate to a new tab and look up the address. It was an empty lot from an abandoned building that has been razed years ago. The Google Maps street view looked somewhat forbidding, but it was within comfortable driving distance of my apartment, which terrified me even more to realize that the center knew what city I lived in. Still, I asked off for work for the date and was racked with dread until it arrived, barely able to concentrate on my job, and drove off to the 3 hours ahead of time, parking my car in the street and was typical for the neighborhood. It was a sunny spring day, and the weird wind made me uncomfortable despite the warm weather. Each passing car made me apprehensive, particularly the ones that were appeared to slow down. I had an overwhelming urge to drive away as the appointed time drew near. When the car stopped at exactly at the time, I was surprised to see a woman get out. She had cropped red hair and appeared to be in her early 40s. She was wearing a black leather jacket and walked right up to me. She smiled slightly. "Hi, you could call me Kathy. I'm from the group you've been looking for." I swallowed and rendered a quite quiet greeting. She didn't look threatening. I had trouble imagining what could have possessed her to join an organization like the Lost Media Group, but right now I had other things to be concerned with. Don't worry, this isn't a setup," she reassured, reading my apprehension. "If we wanted to do you in, we could have and would have done it already." "So, what do you want?" I interjected. "We want you to stop looking into us," she stated plainly, and to that end I managed to convince the higher-ups to let me show you what you've been looking for so that you and me and we can put this behind us. "You mean the Aristocats video?" I asked. She nodded. "For security reasons, we can't just give it to you. The best I could arrange was for you to be allowed to see it under supervision at one of the abandoned movie theaters we used to give private viewings of our works for select patrons. We were about to leave that location anyway, and needless to say, you shouldn't even think about telling people we were ever there." I nodded and grunted. If I meant finally getting answers, I was willing to put up with a little more bullshit. "I hope you have the whole day free, because the theater is several hours away." I nodded again, suspecting that she already knew that answer. We got into her car and we were off. We drove in silence for the first hour or so, then I asked her why the group made lost episodes. She waited a few moments before answering. "Well, I guess you could say we aim to challenge the status quo of programming and give animators a chance to really test their limits. That's why I joined when the organization invited me." "And why do you leak them to the public if you want them keep them secret?" I prodded. "We don't leak them. Sometimes they just get out and people who weren't intended to see them do. I don't know how you ended up seeing one of our works as a kid, but it wasn't supposed to be." "And what about the Kabagama broadcast? Some members of our organization was meeting around when he wasn't supposed to, or maybe it was a TV broadcast only attended to seen by members back in when we were a little more lax about security. Look, I said we'd show you what you've been looking for. Beyond that, I'm afraid I'm not at the liberty to satisfy your curiosity about our inner workings." I was silent for a few more minutes. Her answers were suspect. The Lost Media Group seemed like the type of group that would find pleasure in shocking and traumatizing random people with their twisted works. And I didn't quite buy that all exposure to the non-insiders was unintentional. I brought thought back to the FBI report. I also wondered if she was completely happy with the choice she made to join the organization. "Well, I've already seen a part of your Aristocats edit," I finally said. Kathy pursed her lips, and I could see her eyes that she was briefly considering whether it was worth trying to pretend she didn't know what I was talking about. "Yeah, sorry about that, I guess. But I guess that they figured out if we gave you a good scare, you might give up and leave us alone." I was annoyed at her choice of words, as if they were the ones that only wanted to be left out of peace at all times. I could only wonder if it had been her idea. I also wondered if she knew I had been in several of their other projects as well. "You visited Straubel's old studio. That was when you decided it was time to make a peace offering to get you back off our..." The theater appeared to be one of those many theaters that had been opened in the 90s blockbuster boom and then abandoned during the 2000s. It was along the interstate, isolated from any other buildings. We entered through a side door Kathy had a key for. The lobby was unlit except for the sun outside. I could see a ticket counter, a concession area, and posters for old blockbusters on the wall. Covering the floor was a carpeting of a faded, colorful pattern. Adjacent to the small food court was an empty room, I guess. It was used to be the video arcade. Kathy told me that my phone, which I did. She then escorted me down to the gallery hallway, to the last gallery. She asked me if I was sure I wanted to see this. I answered yes. And she said I could sit anywhere I wanted. I chose a seat near the back while she went up to the projector. I began feeling scared. Sitting there in the dark in the abandoned gallery was very reminiscent of sitting in the dark watching the Aristocats years ago, except for that space even more ominous. When the feature started, I could immediately tell that the audio was off. Sounded shrieking low quality. Otherwise, the movie was normal up until the point the butler decided to get rid of the cats. Instead of drugging them and leaving them abandoned in the normal movie, he drowned them in a river and went down there from there. Suddenly, I was a 5-year-old boy again, watching in horror as the characters were mutilated, decapitated, and burned, while all strange visuals and audio effects were applied. One particularly shocking scene featured real footage of cats attacking and killing a man in real times. Lines were drawn over the scene, covering in sketchwork until it became a completely animated version of itself. It was done with such perfection of technique that I was sure Strobel must have done it himself. I eventually got a grip and was able to sit through the rest of the thing calmly. It wasn't pleasant, but I at least revealed through finally getting it over with. When it was over, think I had tears in my eyes. Kathy drove me back to the empty lot, and it was dark by the time we arrived. Now, before I got out, she spoke to me the last time. Now listen to me. You found what you were looking for, and now that you need to let it go. It took a big risk, even pushing you to let you in behind the scenes for that brief moment. If you continue pursuing information about our organization, we might have to take more drastic measures. We exchanged goodbyes and she drove off. For years, I kept my end of the agreement to never speak a word about her encounter to anyone. However, recently I had considered the bar game. A few days ago, someone reached out to on the web asking me for information on lost episodes. And they claimed to see one as a child and are hoping to find closure for their experience. I'm debating myself whether it's worth letting them on the secret or it would be better for their own sake if I convince them they imagine the whole thing.